On the morning the stone was finally moved, nobody who entered that crypt came back out the same. Not because they had seen something rare, not because they had witnessed a ceremony, not because they had stood near the bones of a famous saint and felt appropriately emotional for a few minutes before returning to normal life. They came out changed, and that is what makes this story dangerous, because when a body has been buried for 8 centuries, when generations are born, age, die, and disappear while it remains hidden underground, when empires rise and collapse, languages change, roads shift, borders are redrawn, whole civilizations forget more than they remember. And still, after all that time, ordinary people step into the presence of what remains and feel something inside themselves rearrange. Then you are no longer dealing with history in the safe, museum sense of the word. You are dealing with a life that never stopped happening. And what startled people on that day was not what they expected to be startled by. It was not merely the age of the remains. It was not the solemnity of the basilica. It was not even the sheer scale of what it meant to stand for the physical relics of one of the most beloved figures in the history of Christianity. It was something more specific, something sharper, something almost unbearable once you really see it. Because what lay inside that crypt was not simply the record of a man who once preached poverty and peace. It was the physical aftermath of a human life lived so completely, so literally, so mercilessly, toward comfort, and so extravagantly toward love, that even 800 years later, the body still seems to be speaking. And here is the part almost nobody tells correctly. What pilgrims were confronting in that underground chamber was not only holiness, it was coherence. The life matched the words, the body matched the message, the bones matched the gospel he claimed had taken hold of him so deeply that he could no longer live for himself in any recognizable way. And in a world where almost everything is performance, where image outruns substance, where people build entire public lives on convictions they never intend to suffer for, that kind of coherence does not merely inspire. It exposes. It exposes the distance between what we admire and what we actually choose. It exposes the way we prefer symbols to obedience. It exposes the way we say we love the poor while arranging our lives to avoid any cost. It exposes the way we long for saints as long as they remain stained glass, silent, tidy, and far enough away not to ask anything from us. But Saint Francis of Assisi does not remain tidy when you are standing in front of what remains of him. He does not remain decorative. He does not remain safe by the time this story is finished. You are going to understand why 800 years of burial could not soften what his life still demands. You are going to understand why a crowd of pilgrims from every continent lined up in the cold dark before dawn to descend underground for a few brief moments in the presence of a man who died in the 13th century. You're going to understand why a community of people living with HIV and AIDS traveled together to that crypt and came away as saying they had felt the presence of the Lord. And you're going to understand why the story is not really about the opening of a tomb at all. It is about the reopening of a question Francis asked not with speeches, but with his body. A question that has waited 8 centuries for this exact kind of world to hear it again. A question that is waiting now for you. Because the moment you truly see what happened in that crypt, it becomes very hard to go back to living as though comfort is the highest good, avoidance is wisdom, and love can remain abstract without costing anything real. The story begins, as these stories often do, not in glory but in disruption. Francis was not born a saint. He was not born poor. He was not born visibly holy. Austere, already pointed toward some great spiritual destiny that everyone around him could immediately detect. He was born into prosperity. His father, Pietro di Bernardone, was a wealthy cloth merchant in Assisi, a man of trade, movement, and practical ambition. His mother came from French nobility. Francis grew up in security, in refinement, in a world where fabric mattered, appearance mattered, songs mattered, public impression mattered. He grew up surrounded by all the little real reinforcements that teach a young man to dream upward into significance. And Francis did dream upward. He loved beauty. He loved celebration. He loved the attention of his peers. He loved the thrill of being admired. He loved the bright, theatrical possibility of becoming someone remembered. Most of all, he wanted to be a knight. That detail matters more than people realize, because knighthood was not merely a profession. It was an imagination. It was the romantic script he had swallowed whole as a young man. Honor, glory, military courage, public recognition, songs written after your triumphs, your name carried in other people's mouths with a certain tone of respect. Francis wanted that world with the appetite of someone who had not yet been broken open by reality. So when war came between Assisi and Perugia, he went to it singing. Imagine that for a moment, not reluctantly, not solemnly. Singing, that's how far inside the dream he was. And then he was captured, almost immediately, thrown into a Perugian prison for about a year, cut off from all the beautiful surfaces that had told him who he was, brought down into a place where status meant nothing, where the body became unavoidable, where fear, humiliation, illness, confinement, and the slow grinding down of illusion began doing their work in him. There are moments in certain lives when everything changes visibly, publicly, in a scene dramatic enough for future generations to point to it and say, there, that was the turning. But there are other changes, deeper ones, which begin in silence while nobody is looking. And by the time the visible transformation arrives, the true shift has already been underway for a long time. Prison was one of those places for Francis. Accounts from those around him suggest something disorienting happened there, while others around him grew bitter, hopeless, unstable, inwardly collapsing under the monotony and humiliation of captivity. Francis remained strangely joyful, not cheerful in the shallow sense, not untouched, not behaving as though imprisonment were pleasant, but carrying some interior buoyancy that made no rational sense given the conditions around him. His companions thought he had lost his mind, but perhaps what they were seeing was not the beginning of madness. Perhaps they were seeing the beginning of detachment. Something was loosening inside him. Something was being stripped. Something that had once seemed indispensable was beginning to lose its hold. He returned home physically weakened. But it was not the sickness people noticed first. It was the change in atmosphere around him. He tried, for a while, to resume the old life. He put the clothes back on. He moved back among the familiar rhythms. He even attempted another military campaign. But the machinery no longer fit him. He rode out again and turned back. Not because he became cowardly, because the script that had once organized his desires had begun to sound hollow in his own ears. That had a frightening kind of grace when it first arrives. Because before God gives you a new life, He often takes away your ability to keep enjoying the old one. You have not yet been rebuilt, but your former pleasures begin failing in your hands. What used to excite you starts tasting thin. What used to reassure you begins to feel staged. The self you once knew how to perform no longer lands naturally in your body. That is where Francis had arrived. He began wandering outside Assisi. He spent time in caves. He prayed alone in ruined chapels and on hillsides. He withdrew from the predictable circuits of social approval that had once fed him. And then came the hinge, the leper. In modern imagination, it is easy to underestimate what lepers meant in medieval Europe. We hear the word and think merely of disease, but lepers were not treated only as sick. They were treated as socially untouchable, liturgically marked, publicly separated. They lived outside the ordinary human boundary. They represented contamination in the eyes of the world, fear made visible in flesh. Bells announced their presence. Distance was built into custom. Revulsion was not private, it was organized. And Francis, the son of wealth, the lover of beauty, the former dreamer of heroic nobility, walked toward one another. His biographers are explicit that he felt horror as he approached. Not mild discomfort, not sentimental compassion overcoming a little squeamishness. Real revulsion, the kind that rises from the body before your ideals have time to speak. Everything in him wanted to recoil, and he kept walking. This is the place where many retellings become too gentle. They make Francis sound as though he was simply better than everyone else from the beginning, already saintly enough to float toward suffering with serene natural ease. But the truth is harder, and therefore far more useful. He moved toward the leper against himself. He crossed the distance in the presence of fear. He did not wait for disgust to vanish. He did not wait to become the kind of person for whom this would feel easy. He obeyed before his senses agreed. Then he touched him, embraced him, kissed him. And after that encounter, he said something extraordinary. What had once seemed bitter became sweet to him, and what had once seemed sweet became bitter. That is not poetry. That is conversion in a sentence. The sweetness of comfort began dying. The bitterness of costly love began changing flavor. The whole moral chemistry of his life reversed. People speak often about Francis hearing Christ at San Damiano, and rightly so. They speak about the stigmata, about the birds, about the poverty, about the canticle of the sun, about his meeting with the Sultan. All of those belong, but the contact with the leper must never be reduced to a side detail, because it was here that his entire life learned its direction. He did not become Francis on a mountaintop first. He became Francis on a road where he could have turned away and did not. Everything that followed passed through that door. Soon after, in the little ruined chapel of San Damiano, Francis knelt before the crucifix and heard words that would reorder his life. Rebuild my church. He understood them first in the most literal way possible. This too is part of what makes him so arresting. Francis was not clever in the modern, ironic sense. He was not interested in managing holy language into something symbolically flexible and emotionally moving while preserving his comfort intact. He heard a command and began carrying stones. He started repairing ruined chapels with his own hands. When he lacked money, he sold cloth from his father's stock, which in the eyes of his father was no longer mystical sincerity but financial betrayal. Pietro dragged him before the bishop in public, and what happened there remains one of the most theatrical acts of renunciation in Christian memory. Francis stood before the square, before the bishop, before his furious father, before the people who had watched him grow up, and stripped himself of every garment he wore. All of it. He handed back the clothes, handed back the inheritance, handed back the claim, handed back, as far as he could, the entire old identity. Then he said he had only one father now, and that father was in heaven. A public nakedness, a public severing, a public refusal to continue borrowing selfhood from wealth. Try to imagine the silence after that, the father gathering the clothes, the crowd staring, the bishop covering him, the old life standing there in a heap on the ground. There are moments when a human being becomes unintelligible to the world that formed them. This was one of those moments. Francis walked out of that square with nothing. Not symbolically nothing. Actually nothing. No money. No property. No secure future. No family backing. No fallback identity. He walked away, stripped down to dependence. And then he never really came back. He gathered companions. Not powerful men. Not strategists. Not aristocrats. Not men who were shopping for influence under a religious banner. He gathered the little brothers, the friars minor, men who would own nothing and live among those the world considered negligible, men who would beg, men who would sleep rough, men who would preach repentance and peace, not from a protected distance but from shared vulnerability. This is where Francis becomes difficult for every age, because he did not merely condemn wealth. He rendered it unnecessary for joy. That is far more destabilizing. People can tolerate holy criticism of the world as long as the critic still visibly needs what the world offers. But Francis produced a form of life that appeared freer, lighter, stranger, more alive precisely because it had refused the usual forms of security. That is what made him radiant and unsettling all at once. He and his brothers walked through the world with a joy that defied economic explanation. That detail appears again and again in accounts of the early Franciscans. Not their discipline alone, not their sacrifice alone, their joy. Which makes no natural sense if your assumptions about happiness are built entirely around possession, control, status, insulation, and future planning. These men had given up ownership and somehow did not look diminished by it. They looked enlarged. That is dangerous evidence in any age. And still, even all of this does not explain what people felt in the crypt 800 years later. To understand that, you have to move forward to the end of his life, and then even further beyond it. Francis did not age into serene institutional success. He aged into illness, strain, conflict, physical pain, and a body already paying the cost of everything he had chosen. His eyesight deteriorated. He suffered intensely. The movement he had founded was growing rapidly, which sounds triumphant, until you remember what growth does to fragile original visions. Structures form, rules harden, people arrive who are sincerely devoted, and people arrive who are calculating. Bureaucracy gathers where charisma once led. Compromises begin appearing in the name of stability. Francis watched this happen to the movement born out of his own renunciations, and it wounded him. Still, he kept going. Then came Mount Laverna, in the autumn of 1224. Francis withdrew there for 40 days of prayer and fasting. He was physically depleted, nearly blind, burdened by pain, burdened by the order, burdened by the strange, impossible nearness of Christ that seemed always to draw him deeper, rather than relieve him. And there, accounts say, he saw a vision of a six-winged seraph with the figure of the crucified Christ between its wings. The important thing is not only what he saw, but what happened in him while seeing it. The sources describe simultaneous joy and sorrow, delight and agony. Love and wound fused together in one experience beyond easy language. Not alternating emotions, not one replacing the other, together. This matters because Francis had spent his life learning that Christ is not encountered by bypassing pain, but by crossing toward it in love. At Laverna, the logic of his whole life intensified into one unbearable, luminous concentration. When the vision ended, the wounds were there in his hands, in his feet, in his side, not symbols, not impressions, wounds, witnesses. Described them in startlingly concrete detail. Piercings through hands and feet, marks like nails driven through and bent back, a wound in the side that bled and stained his tunic. Francis tried to conceal them. That detail is essential. He did not market them. He did not narrate them toward spiritual celebrity. He tried to hide them. Why? Because spectacle was never the point. Because he feared distraction from Christ. Because he feared the human tendency to gather around marvel and misimitation. Because he understood perhaps better than anyone that signs are dangerous when admired without obedience. He hid them as best he could. Others saw, documented, testified. After his death, Brother Elias wrote to the friars of Europe and said that their brother and father had borne in his body the marks of Christ, a sign unheard of from the beginning of the world except in the Son of God. That sentence remains one of the most astonishing ever written in the history of devotion. A man had lived in such radical identification with the poor and crucified Christ that even his flesh became part of the testimony, and that body would become immediately contested. The moment Francis died in October 1226, those around him understood what was about to happen. His body would become an object of intense devotion. In the medieval world, relics were not sentimental keepsakes. They were spiritual centers, civic treasure, prestige, pilgrimage, political energy. Cities fought over. Saints, churches competed for remains. What had been lived in poverty could after death become entangled in power. So the church acted. The body was buried deeply, protected, locked inside an iron cage, hidden beneath a basilica that rose above it. The irony is almost unbearable. The man who spent his life renouncing possession, enclosure, and worldly claim was placed underground in iron for protection from the very love he had awakened. Yet perhaps that too tells the truth about sanctity in this world. We try to guard what we cannot afford to lose, even when the means of guarding appear almost tragic in the light of the saint's own freedom. For centuries his remains remained hidden so thoroughly that even many entrusted with the basilica did not know the exact location. Only in the 19th century were they rediscovered through excavation. The bones were found remarkably intact, preserved, later secured in controlled conditions to slow decay. And then, in the modern age, after long silence, after one highly restricted viewing decades ago, that touched almost no one outside a small circle, the tomb was opened in a way that mattered to the world. February 2026. For the first time, ordinary pilgrims were invited in. Not scholars only. Not clerics only. Not a small protected class of officials, ordinary people. People carrying private sorrows. People carrying curiosity. People carrying wounds. People carrying their own mixed motives and half-believed prayers. People from 5 continents. Hundreds of thousands of them pre-registered. The world came, and before dawn they lined up in the cold. That detail alone deserves to be lingered over, because it tells you something before a single word is spoken. Human beings no longer line up for this kind of thing unless something in them is already starving. They stood in the dark outside the Basilica of St. Francis, not for novelty, not for entertainment, not for a digital experience, not for convenience, to descend underground toward bones. Tell me this is merely history if you can. When the doors opened, they moved in waves through ancient corridors, through stone, fresco, candlelight, silence, toward a glass case containing the remains of a man dead for 8 centuries. And what they met there was not theatrical grandeur. It was fragility. That is another reason this story is so strong. If all they had encountered were power, majesty, spectacle, it would have been easier to keep the experience at a distance. But what they met was poor remains. Human remains. The body of a small, worn, physically unremarkable man who had once walked barefoot, embraced lepers, begged for bread, suffered illness, hidden wounds, and died on the ground. That is what Cardinal Angel Fernandez our time meant when he said the gospel is also lived with the body. This body, this actual body, this poor body, this wounded body, this body that made real choices daily, this body that carried through in flesh what so many people only profess in thought. And once Pilgrims saw that, the abstractions collapsed. Francis could no longer remain a distant icon for ecological concern, peace, birds, sunshine, or medieval charm. He became once again what he had always been, a man who allowed the gospel to invade his concrete life so completely that even centuries later, looking at what remained of him made people feel judged and invited in the same breath. That is why so many could not speak after exiting. That is why some wept. That is why others reached for words, like changed instead of moved. Moved is what art can do. Changed is what encounter threatens. One woman who had lived for years in Assisi, who already knew the story, already loved the saint, already walked daily in the city shaped by him, said the experience of physically seeing his form was utterly life-changing. That matters not because she was ignorant before, but because knowledge is not the same as nearness. One can know a saint with the mind for decades and still not understand what the body will say once it is before you in silence. A teenager came away saying he would never forget the moment. A friar said it felt like meeting a long-lost relative for the first time. That phrase should stop you. A long-lost relative, not a celebrity, not an icon, not a glorious fossil. A relative. There is something deeply Christian in that reaction. Saints are not famous strangers. They are family, but family of a disturbing kind, because unlike ordinary relatives, They do not merely share bloodline or memory. They share possibility. They stand before you as evidence of what a human being can become when Christ is no longer kept in the realm of admiration. And that is perhaps why Francis remains so difficult to look at. Because once he ceases to be decorative, he ceases also to be optional. He asks things, not harshly, not theatrically, simply by existing. He asks whether you love the poor in any way that costs you. He asks whether your spirituality remains mostly verbal. He asks whether your tenderness is still selective. He asks whether you prefer compassion from a safe distance to the contamination of actual contact. He asks who in your world is ringing a bell that others avoid hearing. He asks what you are still arranging your life not to touch. These are not rhetorical questions for effect. They are the core of the whole story. And they become unbearably concrete when you learn who came to that crypt and what they said afterward. Among the many pilgrims was a group from a care home run by the Focalaire movement, a community of people living with HIV and AIDS. They traveled together to Assisi and descended into that crypt. One of them spoke afterward about feeling the presence of the Lord very strongly. Pause there, because if you let the story open in full, this is one of the most piercing moments in the entire event. Francis, centuries earlier, had built his life on crossing toward the ones whom society feared to touch, not because he had no fear, because he refused to let fear decide whom he would call brother. Leprosy in his world functioned not only as illness but as social exile. HIV and AIDS in our own time have carried their own forms of stigma, fear, misperception, and quiet social distancing. Even where medicine has advanced and rhetoric has improved, to live with such a condition is often to know what it means for rooms to reorganize around your existence, for other people's compassion to remain genuine but carefully managed, for the boundary between inclusion and caution to become the emotional climate through which your life is read. And then such a community travels across Italy to stand before the bones of Francis. Do you see the continuity? This is not a sentimental coincidence. This is history reaching fidelity across centuries. This is the same question returning in a new form. This is the saint who walked toward those the world rang bells around now receiving. In death, those who know what it means to carry bells of their own. And they felt the Lord there, of course they did. Because Francis is not powerful in this story. Mainly because he was extraordinary. He is powerful because he became legible to the excluded. His life made sense to the margins. He did not merely preach about the poor. He arranged his whole body in their direction. He did not merely bless the untouchable. He joined them. He did not build a theology of compassion while preserving social distance. He crossed it. That kind of life leaves a trace stronger than reputation. This is also why Brother Giulio Cesario's citat matters so much. Even for those who are not believers, St. Francis is good news. The concrete possibility, historically proven, of a human life not based on competition, but on collaboration and mutual service. Historically proven. Those words deserve weight, because our age is drowning in theories of human flourishing and starving for embodied proof. We are told every day how to optimize, brand, monetize, secure, and preserve ourselves. We are fluent in ambition. We are fluent in posture. We are fluent in curated concern. What we are not fluent in is costly tenderness that does not collapse under pressure. Francis remains terrifyingly relevant because he has historically proven evidence that another kind of life can actually be lived. Not imagined, lived in a body, on roads through illness, through conflict, through misunderstanding, through weakness, through a world no less harsh than ours in the ways that matter most. A small man, dirty clothes, no great physical beauty, no worldly power, no institutional armor when he began, and yet his life continues altering human beings 800 years later. What do you do with that if you are honest? You can admire him, certainly. The world has done plenty of that. You can domesticate him into sentiment. The world has done even more of that. You can reduce him to environmental symbolism. animal tenderness, or picturesque simplicity. That is the modern temptation. But the body in the crypt resists reduction, because bones do not flatter, bones do not market, bones do not adjust their message for comfort. Bones say, "This really happened. This man really gave up wealth. This man really embraced the feared. This man really walked barefoot. This man really bore illness. This man really suffered. This man really continued. This man really loved Christ, poor and crucified, not as a slogan, but as a form of existence." That is why people walk out of the crypt different. Not because relics magically alter the soul by proximity alone, but because truth becomes harder to evade when it has flesh on it. There is another part of this story that presses even deeper. Francis did not become who he became by first solving all the structures of the world. He became who he became by answering one directional question again and again. Toward whom am I moving? That may be the most important practical question hidden in the entire story. Not what do I believe in theory. Not what values do I affirm when asked. Not what causes do I publicly support. Toward whom am I moving? Who receives my time? Who receives my attention? Who receives my body's presence? Whose suffering reorganizes my day rather than merely appearing in my thoughts? Who is outside the boundary of comfort in my world? And what direction are my feet taking me relative to them? Francis answered that question on a hillside with a leper before anyone celebrated him. Before the movement, before the sermons, before the songs, before the visions, before the stigmata, before the basilica, that choice opened everything. And that is why, standing before his bones, people often came away not primarily with admiration, but with disturbance. A good disturbance, the kind that begins where excuses end. A disturbance that asks what in your own life is still built around avoidance dressed as wisdom. There is someone in your world right now, carrying a bell. Perhaps not literally, perhaps not medically, perhaps not in a way visible to the world, but there is someone whose pain makes others nervous. Someone whose presence complicates the emotional economy of a room. Someone whose need is ongoing, not picturesque. Someone difficult. Someone isolated. Someone marked by grief, illness, stigma, failure, addiction, age, mental distress, disability, poverty, or quiet social exile. Someone who is beginning to wonder whether they still exist inside the ordinary circle of human response. And the question Francis asks is not whether you have a moving opinion about such people. It is whether you are moving toward them. This is where the story stops being historical and becomes immediate. Because saints are not given to the church merely as objects of memory. They are given as reopened possibilities. Francis is not an exhibit. He is a question with bones. That is why a young seminarian waiting in line outside the basilica found himself thinking not only about Francis, but about his own life, about where he himself was still needed to be given to the Lord, about where he himself was still negotiating. He stood in the cold, and the line itself became a form of examen. People ahead of him carrying invisible burdens, all of them moving toward the same chamber. All of them exposing by their movement the fact that some things are worth waiting for, if they might tell you the truth about your life. The closer you get to a saint like Francis, the less interested you become in generalized inspiration. You begin wanting specificity. What am I clinging to? What am I protecting? What image of myself still matters too much? What discomfort am I organizing my life to avoid? Which people do I still love, only at a safely managed distance? Where have I mistaken admiration of holiness for participation in it? Which parts of the gospel remain acceptable to me, only as long as they do not become expensive? These are not small questions, and Francis does not let you keep them vague. Even his physical smallness becomes part of the witness. Assisi's bishop described him as barely more than 5 feet tall, not beautiful of face, dressed in dirty clothes. There is something almost miraculous in how consistently God seems willing to build history through forms the world would not naturally choose. A physically unimpressive man in filthy clothing becomes one of the most luminous moral presences in Christian memory. The son of a merchant becomes the brother of lepers. The dreamer of knighthood becomes the servant of the despised. The seeker of songs becomes a body carrying wounds. The man buried in iron becomes, 8 centuries later, a living summons to freedom. This is not just irony, it is revelation. God does not share our instincts about where significance ought to reside. We look for scale, force, polish, credentials, systems, charisma fitted for public dominance. God hides history in the weak, the poor, the small, the surrendered, the unguarded, the seemingly absurd. And when such a life is finally revealed clearly enough, people line up in the cold before dawn to stand near the proof. That is exactly what happened in Assisi. Pilgrims came from across the world. Volunteers gave weeks of service. The lower church became a river of silent bodies descending into stone and rising again with something altered in their eyes. If you ask why, the answer is not only devotion, it is recognition. Something in them recognized something in. Something weary recognized reality. Something hungry recognized food. Something tired of services recognized substance. Something frightened of cost recognized a life that had already paid. Something lonely recognized family. Something exiled recognized home. That is why the story of the HIV and AIDS community matters so much. It is not an emotional add-on. It is one of the clearest interpretive keys to the entire event. Francis still belongs first, in a certain sense, to those who know what exclusion tastes like. Not because he was excluded in the exact same ways. History is never that neat, but because he made his life available in their direction. He let his love cross boundaries that polite society treated as fixed. He built fraternity where the world built distance. That is why his witness remains medicinal in this particular century. We live in a time crowded with contact and starved of communion. We are surrounded by language of empathy and structured by habits of avoidance. We can signal care infinitely while giving very little of ourselves. We can feel morally awake while remaining bodily absent from the people whose suffering would most unsettle our routines. Francis ruins that arrangement. He reminds us that love cannot remain theoretical without finally becoming false. He reminds us that the gospel is not an atmosphere but an embodied direction. He reminds us that holiness is not mainly intensity of feeling toward God, but availability of the self toward those Christ does not avoid. And because he reminds us through an actual body, the message hits harder. This is also why the Church's care for his remains matters symbolically, strange as it may first appear. The iron cage, the hidden burial, the later rediscovery, the modern preservation, the opening to the public after centuries, all of it forms a kind of enacted parable. The world tried to protect the body because it knew the body mattered. History buried him and still could not erase him. Time passed over him and still did not exhaust his relevance. Stone enclosed him and still did not silence the question. There are stories that grow weaker with age. This one grew sharper. Perhaps because the modern world has become so optimized for self-preservation that a life like Francis now appears almost impossible. And when the impossible reappears as fact, people travel across continents to see it with their own eyes. What were they hoping for? Some likely did not know. Some came out of devotion, some out of curiosity, some out of longing, some out of grief, some because the world had become so spiritually thin that they needed to stand near something undeniably real. But by the time they left, many were carrying the same new burden. If this was possible once, what does it ask of me now? That is the real opening of the tomb, not the stone moving, the excuse moving, the excuse that sainthood belonged to another age, the excuse that embodied love is impractical, the excuse that gentleness must remain selective to survive, the excuse that my own comfort is too fragile for costly mercy. The excuse that the VR, poor, the sick, the isolated, the shunned, the inconvenient can be loved adequately through sentiment and occasional concern alone. Francis answers all of that with his life and, astonishingly, with what remains of his body. No, a different human life is possible. It has been historically proven. It can be lived with hands, feet, wounds, weakness, sickness, joy. It can be lived in the real world, not outside it. It can be lived by someone physically small, socially strange, materially poor, and completely surrendered. It can still radiate across 800 years. It can still summon the living. And now the story turns one final time toward you, because after all the history, all the detail, all the wonder, all the scale of the pilgrimage, all of the tears, all the testimony, all the grandeur of a basilica opening a crypt after centuries, the lasting question remains almost painfully simple. Who in your world is carrying a bell? And which direction are you walking? Not eventually, not in the abstract, not after you become spiritually stronger, emotionally steadier, less busy, more resourced, more settled, more admired, more secure. Tomorrow morning, with your actual body, with your actual schedule, with your actual money, with your actual attention, with your actual willingness to be inconvenienced, misunderstood, contaminated by proximity, delayed by compassion, altered by contact. Who are you moving toward? This is the question Francis left in Assisi before he was ever buried there. This is the question the pilgrims felt in the crypt. This is the question that reached the seminarian, the teenager, the friar, the woman long familiar with the story, the community living with HIV and AIDS. This is the question that outlasted iron and stone and 8 centuries. This is the question that the bones are still asking. Do not answer too quickly. Quick answers are often ways of protecting ourselves from the real one. The real answer is written less in what we claim than in where our body goes when suffering appears within range. Francis knew this. That is why the gospel in him did not remain verbal. That is why his sanctity feels so concrete. That is why the body matters. You can lie with language for a long time. You can flatter yourself with noble thoughts. You can speak compassion, and still keep your life almost entirely uncontaminated by other people's wounds. The body eventually tells the truth. It tells the truth in what you touch, in what you avoid, in where you linger, in what you carry, in where your feet are willing to go, and whom your hands are willing to hold. Francis's body told the truth. That is why, centuries later, people still cannot stand before it without feeling their own life become a question. And maybe that is the deepest reason this story had to happen now. Not because the world suddenly became interested in medieval relics, but because the world has become so exhausted by simulation, performance, speed, competition, and lonely self-protection, that when a life of total coherence reappears in view, even in bones, people feel it immediately. They may not have words for it. Many did not. But they knew. They knew they had entered the presence of a yes to poverty freely chosen, a yes to the despised, a yes to fraternity over competition, a yes to service over self-display, a yes to Christ poor and crucified, a yes costly enough to reach the body, a yes enduring enough to outlive centuries, a yes strong enough to ask something of them the moment they stood near it. And that, finally, is why this story matters. Not because a crypt was opened, because a form of human life was uncovered again in public. A life that our age desperately needs, perhaps more than it knows. A life that proves tenderness can be stronger than fear. A life that proves joy does not depend on ownership. A life that proves solidarity with the excluded is not the death of the self but its liberation. A life that proves holiness is not escape from the world's wounds, but entry into them with Christ. A life that proves the gospel can still be lived with the body. So here is the image I want to leave you with. A line of people before dawn in the cold outside a basilica in Assisi. Stone beneath their feet, darkness overhead, each carrying private things no one else can fully see. Some grieving, some searching, some skeptical, some devoted, some tired, some hardly knowing why they came. Then the doors open. They descend. They pass through corridors, painted centuries ago by hands long dead. They move slowly underground. They approach the glass. They see the poor remains of the little man in dirty clothes who walked toward lepers when everyone else stepped back. They stand there, and something in them recognizes home and challenge at once. They climb back into the daylight. The sky is still there. The streets are still there. The world is still waiting with all its urgency and noise and unfinished pain. But they are not quite the same, because once you have stood near evidence like that, once you have seen what a body can become when a soul says yes, without reserve, once you have watched 800 years fail to weaken the force of one life lived entirely toward love, it becomes harder to spend your own life pretending not to know what matters. And maybe that is the grace of this whole event. Not that it gave people a beautiful memory, but that it removed one more excuse for delay. The invitation Francis lived remains open. Move toward the one the world avoids. Touch what fear tells you to keep distant. Let sweetness change flavor. Let your life become legible to the poor. Let the gospel reach your body. Let your choices become visible enough to wound your comfortant and heal someone else's loneliness. Let your presence say, brother, where the world says burden. Let your feet answer the bell, because the iron cage could not keep this story. Stone could not finish it. Silence could not age it out. And if you have heard it today and felt even the faintest disturbance in your chest, then perhaps it has already begun arriving in your life exactly where it was meant to. Not as information, as summons. Not as admiration, as direction. Not as history, as family, and the question remains, waiting with extraordinary patience, the way a long-lost relative waits across a table, not accusing, simply present, refusing to disappear until you answer honestly. Who are you moving toward? Thank you for staying here through this story. Some stories do not ask to be consumed quickly. They ask to be carried. If this reached something in you, do not rush past it. Sit with it. Let it bother you a little. Let it name someone in your mind. Let it push against the architecture of your days. Because the deepest honor we can give a saint like Francis is not merely to admire what he became. It is to become less resistant to the same direction of love. And if there is one person in your life right now who rings a bell the world has taught itself not to hear, then perhaps the holiest thing you can do after this video ends is not to say more about Francis. It is to walk toward them.